from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. Athens alone, Greece, with its immortal glories, is free to decide its future at an election under British.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast with your host Stephen Norman and producer James Orman. Your Hour of History begins right now.
Welcome. That was Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, where he describes that an iron curtain has descended across Europe, and these once great cities, these cities that we knew historically as fantastic places, no longer have access to the West. Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech is a good place to start because of what we covered last week. Last week when we talked about the League of Nations and how it had failed and created this, or failed to create a safe place that would prevent World War II. And instead we're left with this terrible disaster. Germany's not supported during its depression, it strikes back, and the world has to respond to the atrocities that it's committed. So then we have the beginning of the United Nations, the first few years, and then you have this great uncertainty because of the new bipolar world. You have the Soviet Union supporting their communist stance on one hand, and on the other hand you have the capitalist power, the United States of America. Two extreme powers in the world, two different points of view, an enormous amount of firepower that could destroy the world at any time, and this organization, the United Nations, that claims that it has the ability to stop this. So I've entitled Week 2, Working Together Behind an Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain, of course, being what was so vividly painted in his words by Winston Churchill, the description of the separation between the East and West, two different sides of the world, different perspectives on economics. And as we all know, money matters very much, and this perspective on economics did involve politics, and it involved the choices that people made, and ultimately cost many people their lives. And there are some arguments that it saved a lot of lives, but we'll get into that later. For right now, let's talk about just what we talked about last week. First, we have this map of the United Nations. We saw it last week. The light blue is the countries that were in the United Nations from the beginning. The dark blue, those are countries that do not rule themselves. The people are subjects to an imperial power. And the gray are countries that did not join or were not admitted to the United Nations. So you can see countries like Japan, the Koreas, the Central European powers, the former Axis powers, the fascist Spanish regime under Franco. They were not allowed in the United Nations. So already you have a United Nations that is not speaking for the entire world. Now, if you looked at the UN Charter, the Security Council, one of the most important parts of the United Nations, has some important articles. I want to focus right now on Article 39, 41, and 42. Article 39 is basically saying the Security Council their job is to determine the existence of any threat to peace and make recommendations. So if something's happening in the world and the Security Council says, well, this is not right, that's their job. So they're supposed to determine a threat to peace and make recommendations. So they might say, North Korea is threatening South Korea. We will no longer allow Japan to trade with North Korea. Now that's just a hypothetical situation, but that's something the Security Council might do. Article 41 is basically explaining what can the UN do without using force. So like I mentioned, Article 39, the Security Council determines something's wrong. They say, okay, we need to do something. Article 41, this is what the UN does. They interrupt in economic relations. They focus on things like rail, air, sea, post, in the old days, telegraph, radio, and other means of communication. These are what we know as sanctions. So if you've been checking the news lately, there's sanctions on Russia because they're not behaving properly since Russia essentially took over a part of the Ukraine. They've had sanctions on them from the rest of the world. That's Article 41. Another example is North Korea. You might see them in the news testing their missiles. One of the things that the world does is aircraft don't fly over North Korea because North Korea won't follow international air rules, so their air traffic controllers won't speak English, for instance. But also, we don't know when they're testing missiles, etc. We being the people of the rest of the world, non-North Koreans. Article 42 then says if Article 41 doesn't work, the United Nations can take the necessary action that must be taken, including military operations, to remedy the problem. But now the United Nations doesn't have an army. So then you're looking at these countries in the light blue that have to do something to remedy the problem. They have to come together and decide who's going to contribute what to this cause of Article 42. So last week I talked a little bit about the Korean War. The Korean War was really the first test for the United Nations. There were other tests, but the Korean War was a good test. Now, I wanted to bring the Korean War back to your attention because there was just an article last week that highlighted a study that asked Americans to point out North Korea on a map. The light blue dots that you see on that map are where Americans thought North Korea was. The fact that there's some light blue dots in the middle of the ocean makes me wonder if people were taking this seriously or if they thought the dark gray was ocean. I don't know. But you can see there's dots everywhere. This was kind of an amazing thing that, generally speaking, Americans didn't know that what I just highlighted in the red circle is indeed Korea, the Korean Peninsula, between Japan and China. And you can see the little heavily more dotted one is North Korea. Because this was a huge war. It's what's called now the Forgotten War. It was one of the first chances the UN had. Like I explained before, the UN was able to send a military there because the Soviet Union, who supported the North, was not present in the UN deliberations. So the UN sends a force to go fight this Korean War. And this war lasts 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days until the ceasefire. Technically, the war between North Korea and South Korea is still going on. But there was a ceasefire after 3 years, right about the same area that separated North Korea and South Korea from World War II. Now, that's an interesting topic that you can certainly research yourself. Why were there even two Koreas? And that, goes back to Japanese colonialism, the effects of World War II, the occupying powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, setting up these new regimes. But the fact is, there was a fight between North Korea and South Korea, and 16 nations in the UN command joined South Korea to fight North Korea. And North Korea had only the Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union, and China, the Communist China, to help it. So it was 17 nations against 3. Now, the UN peacekeepers, and these are the 17 nations, stay in South Korea until 1967. So from the 50s through the 60s, the UN has these people who wear the iconic blue helmet as peacekeepers in South Korea. After 67, the US and South Korea take over operations, which is still the situation today. But now the crazy thing about Americans not knowing where this is, not just the fact that it only happened, 60 years ago, was also the fact that 2.5 million civilians were killed or wounded. This is huge after World War II. It's not long after World War II, less than a decade. And over 2.5 million civilians, so these are people who do not fight at all, are killed. For the UN forces, 200,000 were dead or missing. For the North Korea, Soviet, Chinese forces, 800,000 about dead or missing. That's a lot of people. So hopefully you take the time to think about the significance of this and what it may or may not have impacted on your life years later. And even though it's on the other side of the world, look at your phone. If it's from Samsung, if it's from LG, those are phones from South Korea. This is a country that was essentially, in this case, the UN ensured its existence, and then it's created into this sort of economic giant and starts developing cars and phones. If you drive a Hyundai or a Daewoo, there's all kinds of ways Korea influences our world today, and that's South Korea. So this has roots back in the Korean War. So it's important the United States should be able to find South Korea and North Korea and China and Japan and on a map. So if you weren't able to do that and you had to wait till I highlighted it, I suggest there's some great resources out there to go study maps and just educate yourself about the world you live in, because someday you might take a flight there and you'll get off the flight and you'll see millions and millions and millions of people walking around, and you'll think, wow, when I was worried about what to have for breakfast, these people might have been worried about the same thing. Or when I chose what to wear tonight or what to watch on Netflix, they were probably thinking the same thing, even though they're on the other side of the world. So it's important to look that kind of stuff up. Here's another map of the Korean conflict. You can see in green how far the United Nations actually got to winning this war. This is before China enters the war. The UN gets all the way to the border of North Korea and China before China pushes back, and ultimately they end in a stalemate right about where that middle arrow is. And that's where it stays today. North Korea and South Korea still don't get along. And if you look at the news, North Korea is still in the news often. South Korea is in the news often. So it's an important place to learn about, especially if people are talking about it. Back to the map of the United Nations. Now, one of the problems that we talked about last time was that there's 5 major powers that have vetoes. Now, I want you to be able to locate these on maps as well. One of them, everyone should be able to do this, is the United States. The United States has veto power. Another 2 in this circle are Great Britain and France, Russia, and China. So now I circled the tiny little island off what you might say, wait a second, that's actually China. Because when the UN was started, the Republic of China was only in that island. That's the democratic capitalist country, and the communist country was over to the side, the People's Republic of China. So these 5 powers, and you might notice, wait a second, There's none in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, or Australia. That's crazy, considering most of our people are in those countries, those continents. Yes, so this is one of the problems of the UN. It's these Western powers, with the exception of China, that have control over the direction of the United Nations. So now during Korea and Vietnam, the Soviet Union is not there. Later on, say during the Iraq War, France refuses to vote in favor of it. When this happens, countries tend to act unilaterally by themselves. So this is one of the problems of the UN. Meanwhile, there's hundreds of other nations who, just like France, UK, Russia, United States, and China, also have goals of their own, feelings of their own, problems of their own, and they're just largely ignored. Now, with all that said, even those five powers, now if a resolution is passed, all five powers have to agree with it to go. Yet, two of those sides within the powers are clearly defined. The Soviet Union and the Communist People's Republic of China, they're both communist. So they're on the one side of what Churchill describes as the Iron Curtain. On the other side is France, UK, and the United States. So how is anything ever going to get done by the United Nations if these two sides don't agree? Well, that's exactly the problem with the Cold War. So this map shows the Cold War, the Iron Curtain division. On the left, the blue nations, you have Western Europe. And on the right is the Eastern European communist nations. So, and the little black dot on the other side is Berlin, which is split between both. So, Churchill's Iron Curtain is pretty clear. The countries on the side of the Soviet Union tend to work together. They form things like the Warsaw Pact, the Council for Mutual Economic Existence, and the Soviet Union is the leader. On the other side, they create organizations like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the United States is the preeminent power. So now, say there's an event where the Soviet Union says, oh, we shouldn't go fight, but the US says we should. In that case, often what happened was NATO goes instead of the United Nations. So NATO is kind of like a Western version of the United Nations. It's another thing to keep in mind when reading about the Cold War United Nations. Now, a couple times, these conflicts, and here's the United Kingdom, here's France, here's Russia. So you can see opposing sides of the spectrum, opposing sides of the wall. Now, sometimes these conflicts boiled over. You have on the left Winston Churchill. He's the former British Prime Minister who sort of saw this Iron Curtain problem happening, this division between East and West. In the middle is President Eisenhower, the United States president at the time, who wanted, in his words, to have the United Nations go and fix problems in the world. But for Eisenhower, a lot of times the problem was when new unstable regimes would arise and, not have the same values as, say, the United States. They wouldn't be capitalist and they wouldn't be on the right side of the Iron Curtain divide. To his right is Che Guevara, who also seemingly had the same concern. He wanted a peaceful coexistence between people in different countries with different economic and social systems. The problem with these views, both with Guevara and with Eisenhower, is there's a lot of places in the world where it's not working out. So there's apartheid in South Africa. In Puerto Rico is still part of the United States, even though Cuba is free. The Congo in the center of Africa is now going under an independence struggle. Vietnam's fighting France for its independence. Cyprus is torn between Greece and Turkey. And several other Latin American countries are also having problems. So Che declares, we want to see this assembly shake itself out of complacency and move forward. We want to see the UN committees begin their work and not stop at the first confrontation. Imperialism wants to turn this meeting into a pointless oratorical tournament instead of solving serious problems of the world. We must prevent it from doing so. This session of the Assembly should not be remembered in the future solely by the number that defines it. Our efforts are directed to that end. So what he's saying is that even though we have this United Nations organization, if we're on different sides, no one's listening to each other and we're not working together to move forward. There's these huge conflicts and challenges in Korea, in Vietnam. The Cuban Missile Crisis happens a little later, where we really find out that important decisions during the Cold War are made in Moscow, in Russia, in Washington, D.C. for the United States, and not at the United Nations. So this dominates an enormous period of history of the 20th century. The second half of the 20th century is this enormous conflict between the East and the West, the communists and capitalists, the Cold War. And you know, I can go back to this map, and there were green countries. You see the green country, that's Yugoslavia. Some countries who Yugoslavia, while they were communists, they didn't ally themselves with the Soviet Union. So there were countries in this United Nations world who did not go along with this. Until the 60s, you can see on this map, West Africa was still under French control. So they didn't have millions of Africans did not even have a choice if they want to work with the United Nations or if they don't want to work with the United Nations or whatnot. They had no vote because they were still part of French West Africa. So the goal of all that information that I've just given you is to give you a sense of the enormous trouble of bringing the world together after these two massive conflicts. So you might take it for granted nowadays. You can go to the airport. If you buy a ticket, if you have enough money, you can go buy a ticket and fly almost anywhere in the world. All you need is a passport and a ticket. That kind of thing did not exist in the second half, the early part of the second half of the 20th century. So the post-war 1950s, 1960s. You just couldn't do it. If you were born in, say, East Germany, which was part of the Soviet sphere of influence, which was a communist nation, you couldn't just hop on a plane and fly to vacation in, say, I don't know, Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico was part of the United States. However, if you were in East Germany, you could hop on a plane and fly to Cuba if you had enough money, because Cuba was also communist. Now, if you were in Miami, only 30, 40 miles away from Cuba, you couldn't go to Cuba because the United States declared it a state in rebellion, not a real country. But you could, if you were in Miami, go to Puerto Rico, no problem. So you can see the complex ways in which the world was operating at those times. Now, one of the most complex situations and most interesting situations and most ignored situations of this entire century, the 20th century, 1900 to 1999, I guess, 2000 you could say, is Africa. Africa in 1950, post-World War, 5 years after World War II, is still a mishmash of the original Berlin Conference, the land grab of Africa, where European colonial nations carved out Africa into empire. You can see from the map, France had the west, the British had the east, the British had a lot of the south, The Belgians were there, Portugal had bits on the coast, and even Spain had some. Now, one of the reasons for having the UN was to help usher in this new era, this no longer colonial era, the New World. But that was hard to do, considering that a lot of these nations didn't necessarily want to give up what they had in Africa. Now, before we get too much into Africa, I just want to go over briefly the agencies of the United Nations and break it down so you can kind of understand how they would interact with these problems. So, in the United Nations, there's 6 principal organs. There is the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, and the International Court of Justice. So first, the General Assembly. That's where the nations of the United Nations meet and talk about the issues at large. So if you look at this map of Africa, not many of these nations in 1950 go to meet at the UN. In fact, I only see Egypt and Ethiopia. Those 2 nations, Liberia as well. Those 3 nations can go to the United Nations and they can say, well, I don't like what's going on in Africa. And, they can try to pass resolutions. All the other nations in Africa at that time are French West Africa. So France would speak for West Africa, and they would maybe say to Egypt, well, we're getting a lot of benefit from West Africa, so no need. We got this. Now, the next principal organ of the UN is the Security Council. So if you look at the big green part in the center of Africa right there, Belgian Congo. When Belgian Congo starts fighting for its independence and tries to become Democratic People's Republic of Congo, the Security Council has to make a decision. Well, do we go and restore order in the Congo? Because technically it was Belgium's possession, but these are human beings who are fighting for their own country. So what do we do? That's the job of the Security Council to decide. Unfortunately, the Security Council, especially in the case of Congo, makes a complete mess of everything, and years of civil war end up in 2 Congos that we have today, not to mention millions of people dead and the near possibility that the entire Earth would be destroyed by the 2 Cold War powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, who had different perspectives at the time. Cuba was also heavily involved, and that's one of the things you'll hear in Che Guevara's speech about the Congo, saying, these are people who get to deserve, they get to choose who their leaders are. It's actually their right. Now, the Economic and Social Council, their job was to have made sure that the Congo had enough money and was successful enough to have its independence. Now, if the Economic and Social Council had a situation like this one that I've circled, Ghana, where the future UN Secretary General Kofi Annan is from, they had a little less work to do, because there's a reason these places like Ghana and you look over to Nigeria are called the Gold Coast. There's a lot of resources there. They have oil, they have gold. So their struggle was a tiny bit less than, say, Belgian Congo, which is a massive, massive country. We'll skip the Trustee Council for now and go to the International Court of Justice, which comes along later and basically is supposed to make sure people follow international laws. Now, aside of those 6 principal organs within the UN, there's a bunch of subsidiaries and partners, so thousands of NGOs are working alongside the United Nations. One, for example, in the case of the country right to the right of the Congo, Kenya, is the American Friends Service Committee. Now, that's a Quaker organization that's headquartered in Philadelphia. They're sending people to Africa to care for other people that are forgotten, injured, or hurt because of the conflicts that are not resolved by the UN. So there's thousands of organizations, just like the AFSC. Those are NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that attempt to help where the government was not so successful in solving its own problems. In addition to those subsidiaries and partners, the UN has programs, funds, and agencies. And a lot of these get more finely established later as we go on. Those are like the World Health Organization, UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the UNHCR, which is the UN High Commission for Refugees. So when a conflict like it's in, say, Belgian Congo happens and everyone tries to go to Tanzania or Burundi, then the UNHCR works with that. So you have all these organizations that are supposed to work to conclusions to help these conflicts resolve themselves. And unfortunately, what happens is, because of that five-power system and because of the way the world was split along these economic guideposts of capitalism and communism, and countries like Congo were just trying to get free, but yet they had to decide, did they want to side with the capitalists or the communists? And then if you chose communists, then the capitalists would be after you. If you chose capitalists, then the communists would be after you. So it's a very complex world. And I urge you to look at some of these countries, find one that interests you, and just read about it. This whole area, the Union of South Africa, Southwest Africa, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, Mozambique, Angola, incredibly interesting, challenging stories that have happened in the last 75 years. Now, if you've watched, say, Invictus or Mandela, he had some good press, and South Africa was well publicized by a lot of these subsidiaries and attached organizations of the UN. So, like, a lot of people had a problem with apartheid in South Africa, so we know about it a little more. But a lot of similar struggles were going on in Rhodesia and Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. So I strongly, it's more than I could possibly talk about in an hour, and I strongly suggest that you look at some of these far off places, some of these countries. Madagascar, for instance, is in blue. Even though it's off the coast of a Portuguese colony and it's surrounded by British colonies, that's a French colony. So what's happening in Madagascar? And so there's an enormous amount of information. There's a lot of people that live in these countries, and it's certainly worth some research into. Now here's another look at the UN, the organization. Now the idea that the General Assembly could come together on these issues and figure it out it sounds good, but then you think about Temple's new football stadium that they wanted to build, and when people would come together in, say, a General Assembly and try to talk about it, what would happen? People would shout, people would yell, and then they'd leave not agreeing with each other anyway, just like they did in the first place. This is one of the problems of the General Assembly. It's a good idea in practice. Have people come, have people talk about what they like or don't like about what's happening in the world. Problem is, what's it gonna do? So this is another rich resource that's out there. Go to search UN General Assembly videos on YouTube. Go to the live UN channel that's linked on my website, sites.temple.edu/Bauman. There's a 24-hour stream of what's happening at the United Nations, and you can watch in September the head of state, so maybe it'll be Trump for us in this September, speaking to the United Nations about what is the most important thing in the world right now. Now, there's some great historical ones. Certainly Eisenhower's speech to the United Nations paired with Che Guevara's speech to the United Nations. These are important politicians addressing the United Nations in hopes that things will change. And you can look, take one step away from the General Assembly to that International Court of Justice, and you will see how these things have failed. And the International Court of Justice will point back to the General Assembly, and they will say, but look, in the General Assembly, so-and-so said this was wrong years ago, and you continue to do it. You continue to break international law. This is a problem. The Security Council might go to the General Assembly and say, look, we can't trust these people because they continue to tell us something is happening, yet our Trusteeship Council, the one who overlooks everything, is finding other results. So this is the organization, this is the way the United Nations works. Now, the way I've framed this week is to pair it with Kofi Annan's book, Interventions. Now, Kofi Annan was the Secretary General. He was from the Gold Coast that I just highlighted. He was from Ghana, but he was educated in the United States. His father worked for United Africa Company, which was a subsidiary of the Anglo-Dutch company that we now know today as Unilever. So his dad worked for Europeans. So Kofi Annan came from a very wealthy family that had access to boarding schools, but he was brought up in Africa during the independence movement. So Kofi Annan grows up in Africa in the 1950s and 60s when these countries are just becoming free. So he sees what it's like to struggle for independence against a previous history of working for Europeans in this case. When he's at boarding school, he actually goes to a Methodist boarding school. Methodism is a British religion that goes to the United States. They set up missions abroad, and he goes to this Methodist boarding school in Ghana, where he learns English and French. He also goes to the United States. He eventually gets his master's degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He works in the United Nations, and he always has this commitment because when independence is first happening, there's this movement, the Organization of Africa, that newly independent African states figure out, okay, there's the communist Soviet Union, the capitalist United States, we need to work together as Africa, one Africa. And so Kofi Annan sees where that is successful and where that goes terribly, terribly wrong, especially in coup d'etat, when military governments overthrow states, especially with dictators in the case of, say, Zimbabwe, where you have a revolutionary who wants to change the world and then takes power all for himself and refuses to give it up. So Kofi Annan has his education in Africa, and it sort of gives him this idea that international organizations offer opportunities for people in poorly governed territories to step outside of the poor administration of their own country. So if your country's not run well, you don't have to lose hope. You can go to an international organization that can help your country get back on tracks. It's not to say that the international organization is going to take over. The international organization is not your government. You don't lose your identity, but it's someone to make sure that things don't get out of control. So Kofi Annan brings these rich experiences to his own personal experience as the UN Secretary General. He's one of the few people who both promoted the UN in a way to where he was respected widely, but he did not lose power that way. He was respected because he stood up for what he believed was right, and he did not back down. He did not get intimidated from 4:30 a.m. phone calls from certain nations suggesting that he read pre-written notes that surrender the United Nations position in favor of their interests. He stuck for the Charter of the United Nations and that idea of we the peoples. Every person of the United Nations, man, woman, or child, with their inalienable rights. So Annan is an important piece to this entire story, and he continues to come up throughout the next few weeks as a way of understanding the interplay between all these individual, unique nations with their own interests. So this week, I encourage you to look up a couple nations, and just a couple nations that interest you. Say you go back to that map and you find one or two for whatever reason that it jumps out at you. Maybe it has an interesting name, or maybe it's by the coast, or maybe it's in the middle of the continent, or whatever. Maybe you know someone from there. Maybe you have ancestors from there. Choose any country in the world and study what was that country's interest, what was that country's goal, and how did that play into this conflict? Think about it in the context of, on one side you have a communist Soviet Union, on the other side you have the capitalist United States, yet what does this country think? And I encourage you to do that with as many countries as you can find, because that will make your experience trying to understand the United Nations more rich and more developed, as with world affairs. Another way to do this is open a newspaper or go online, and what is the first country that's talked about? Is it Russia? Is it North Korea? Look into that country. Where is it? What did it join the United Nations after World War II? What's its relation with the United Nations? Has it fought with the United Nations? These are all important things to consider when you're looking at the United Nations and when you're looking at world affairs. So now, with all that in mind, I leave you with this complex situation in the world, with a Cold War that has to work beyond an iron curtain, an immovable curtain that has to somehow talk and listen and communicate behind an iron curtain. Nowadays you can slam the door on someone and you can kind of shout through the door and hear a muffled cry, but iron curtain, you can't hear someone on the other side of iron. And something to think about is these two countries had enormous reserves of bombs and munitions, and they didn't trust each other, they didn't necessarily like each other, and they could destroy each other and the whole world. So that's something to think about when you're choosing and researching a country. Now, the United Nations building is in New York City. It's on 39th Street. And right across from the park, right across from the United Nations building, is a park. And in the park, there's a memorial wall. It's called the Isaiah Wall. And this is just right across from the United Nations. Now, the Isaiah Wall quotes Isaiah 2:4. The quote is, "And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." And what that means is embodied in the mission of the United Nations, changing swords into plowshares.